I hope you are feeling hydrated. I hope you are feeling relaxed. You're feeling comfortable wherever you are, and you're ready for our next little block of content, if you were. I'm pretty stoked for this. It's an opportunity to sit down to talk, for me to get a chance to sit down and chat with Patrick Debois, who is the VP of Engineering at Showpad, but has donned many hats and has done many things over what is really an illustrious career. I had the pleasure and the honor of meeting Patrick many years ago, and we've gotten to collaborate on a couple of projects over the years. Really great guy, and really, really stoked to have an opportunity to sit down and chit-chat, pick his brain a little bit about, well, certainly about DevOps, right? But also to help us understand current IT organizations, right? Like, how can we be organizing ourselves? How can we take what we already know and apply it to the future to make things better, right? To wit, Patrick is the co-author of a lot of things, a lot of publications, but notably the DevOps Handbook, how to create world-class agility, reliability, and security in technology organizations, alongside such other industry luminaries as Gene Kim, John Willis, Jez Humble, right? Now, for those of you maybe who haven't been around as long as the rest of us, maybe new to the world of DevOps, Patrick actually first presented some concepts on something called Agile Infrastructure in Toronto at a conference, Agile 2008. There's a conference in Toronto, Canada at the time. And those concepts, Agile Infrastructure, Agile System Administration, ended up becoming really the foundational elements of what we call DevOps today. So I would like to welcome to the stage everybody, Patrick Debois, the godfather of DevOps. Patrick, how you doing this evening, sir?
Hey, Dan. Well, I'm happy to see you again. It's been a while. You give me way too much credit, though, but anyway, much appreciated for all the kudos.
You're too humble. You're too humble. So we're gonna sit down. We're gonna have a little chat. But I want to remind everybody that the idea is that this is interactive, right? So if you have questions, any questions at all that you are curious about, that you want to sort of talk about on the way, that you want me to ask, please just pop them into the Slido. We're putting the link in there now into the chat. So definitely don't hesitate, ask those questions, and we'll get this conversation started. I'd also like to remind everybody that if you are interested in joining the raffle for the KubeCon tickets, KubeCon EU tickets, all you need to do is ask a question, because we're going to be drawing the winner from the list of people who have asked questions. So when you choose your name for Slido, choose whichever name you registered for DevOpsDays with. That way we can line up your name in Slido. If you win, with who you actually are, we can contact you and get those tickets out to you. All right, everyone? Sounds good. This is normally where I'd ask for thumbs up. Could I get but I'm just going to assume everybody understands what's happening right now.
Yeah, there's only one question people cannot ask. What's the future of Kubernetes? So I have no clue. I have no clue on that answer. So don't ask me that question.
The future of Kubernetes, man, no one knows what the future of Kubernetes is. All right. So we do have some questions already in the Slido. So thank you so much for that. The most upvoted question by far, and this is a fun one, and I'm going to throw it right at you, Patrick, because I think this is a good icebreaker, right? Which is, if you could magically change one thing about DevOps today, what would it be?
Yeah, it's I think I initially would say it is like open spaces. Whatever happened was the right thing that would have happened, right? And in like the fact that it's just zeitgeist and we got together and ideas bubbled up and the industry has formed its own mind of what DevOps is, and it's like, even irrelevant what we think about it. It's like kind of like what people made of this. I think it's there's a difference in maybe what, like, from where I started out thinking about DevOps was, the collaboration aspect. And I do see still a lot of people kind of emphasizing that part and kind of continuing that conversation. But I almost like certain that like the majority of people who are farther away even from this conference in IT, they started equating this with, oh, it's Kubernetes, it's Docker, it's the CI, it's the pipeline. And I think that's kind of, it was very instrumental in the way that those technologies helped shape our thoughts on how collaboration would happen and the practices. But if that would be one thing I changed, I would like even started more banging the drum of the collaboration and kind of make it survive. And I'll add to that maybe that, and it will feel very weird. This conference as such, I always thought in the beginning, in one way, we should, by being 10 years, we should not have our own conference, in a way that it would just be absorbed in agile thinking or kind of product thinking and things like that. But I do realize there's always new people coming to the field, and they also kind of have their their learning experience. So in that way, these kind of events keep being very useful, and obviously to expand the field and to have those conversations. But in a way, I would have maybe anticipated it to be closer absorbed in all the rest than kind of being on the side. I don't know whether you can kind of agree with that answer somehow, or I don't know.
Well, it's interesting, that you say that sort of 10 plus years on. We often talk about a decade of DevOps, but it's the term is older than that now. Boy, what even is time? But in the 10 plus years that we've been around, we have this. This has come up right away, which is DevOps dead? Does DevOps has a future? And then of course, actually DevOps is not dead. DevOps has a future. And then 6 months later, is DevOps dead again? And it goes through these up and down cycles, right? And I would argue that DevOps principles, and you can interpret that any way you want, have permeated, frankly, into a lot of these spaces. So there continues to be DevOps days, there continues to be DevOps themed events and conferences and books and so on and so forth. And I don't think that's necessarily incorrect. But if, the idea of breaking down silos, the CAMs, right? The culture automation, measurement sharing, sometimes we cram a letter L in there. These things are not weird anymore, right? You see it as just part of how people are doing business, how teams are interacting and building, and I don't think that's very strange anymore. And I guess that comes to the next question. Actually, it's a reasonable segue, which is talking about platform engineering. There's a fairly well-known book that got written some time ago by some people over at a certain search engine-based company about SRE, and it introduced a lot of these principles of reliability engineering, a lot of principles today we recognize as platform engineering. What are your thoughts on platform engineering and the impact of DevOps, on that, and the inverse? Has platform engineering as a methodology had an impact on DevOps?
Yeah, I think it certainly has. I'll try to replay how it like fits my head, and again, like for everybody, it could mean different things. For me, it happened that SRE came into the equation on making it more measurable. Like the whole book had a lot of examples of error budget, SLOs, SLIs, and in that way, I'm doing it short in a way that like it's being reduced, much like we would do DevOps short by saying it's a pipeline and a kind of a container and Kubernetes. But again, that's what kind of a lot of people think that brought into the table. But it did bring some engineering rigor, being better defined. So that helped a lot of people to kind of quantify the progress that was being made. But I always say, if let's say you're doing your operations and you're having uptime and you're measuring everything from whatever goes in and out, that's engineering work. If you're doing this to bridge a silo, then to me this becomes DevOps, right? So one can be really instrumental by, for example, showing the metrics to the business so they improve their thing, and then to improve what they do in coding. because they show the correct error budgets. Those are practices that like technically help the collaboration and the cultural aspect. So that's kind of how I look at SRE as a useful extension and a better defined way of kind of collaborating with these metrics and kind of expressing them. Again, I'm doing it very short because it's bigger than that, but it's kind of what the majority, I think, like put under the bucket of SRE.
Right.
Platform engineering. Sorry, go ahead. No,
I was going to say we could spend the entire time talking about just this question, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's huge. It's an enormous subject, right?
Yeah.
And then it leads, to the sort of the default question, and I alluded to it earlier. Is DevOps dying with SRE and platform engineering becoming more common? And DevOps is not dying. DevOps is just normal now. So that's why you don't see it everywhere now. That's just how things are, right? Like, our seatbelts dying? No, that's just what's in cars now, right? We don't think about it anymore. Yeah, exactly.
And to maybe finish the talk on platform engineering, if that's okay, Dan.
Sure.
For me, it stems from the fact very early days DevOps, we had the developers and the operations, and it was all about getting things to production and the CI pipeline, and we got better at continuous integration, delivery, and that was working. Then the whole mantra became you build it, you run it, like things became virtual, cheap, you kind of like spread this out into the teams. For me, when platform engineering really started to pick up is that when a lot of companies shifted their own organizational to that kind of you build it, you run it, and kind of the pizza teams, all of a sudden they realized that it's not like everybody does whatever they want. There's a common ground, like in a democracy, and kind of you have a set of rules where you do certain things, and things like budget, like who runs this, right? Sometimes it's more efficient to do something like this centrally. Getting some governance in place, how we do things, that's also something that could be done by a central group that helping the others kind of scale developer experience. So they all fall in those buckets as the organization was changing. Those aspects did not have the right home anymore. So platform or platform engineering became that home of the things that fell in between the brackets. And for me, if you're doing platform engineering right, it's not about you building the platform and just writing the documentation. It's like effectively helping the other groups. So in that way, it is another manifestation of collaboration across silo that a platform team is ultimately having as a goal. It's not about just running and operating the platform, is by seeing the other parts of the organization as your customers, helping them out, doing cross collaboration, kind of a pollination across the teams to kind of, hey, they're doing something great, they are doing something else, how can we kind of mold those things together? So for me, that cultural aspect is an evolution of a practice that started because the organizational structure changed. And I think that's maybe brings into, like, whenever we do something in a company to bridge a silo or to bridge a gap or kind of have them collaborate, your kind of bottleneck will move. So one of the core principles was you optimize the whole and not the specific parts. And so when these things are moving, part of the tenet there is that you start looking for the next bottleneck and kind of the solution for the next bottleneck. So that's kind of how I see platform as a way of collaborating in a novel way because the structure changed in a company.
Right, and that's fair. We had already a presentation earlier from Manuel about about this idea of platforms and platform teams, and about how do you stream work through them, and so on and so forth. And again, there lots to discover and lots to explore. One of the terms that gets bandied about when we talk about work and responsibilities and breaking down of silos is this idea of shifting left, right? Mm-hmm. So if maybe for those of you in the audience, we'll start right there actually. So first off, shift left. I mean, what does that word, what does that phrase mean?
Yeah. So when we brought in kind of another silo, the security folks who kind of felt left out of the kind of a new way of working, they were having problems on kind of like how you do this technically and how I kind of bring security as a first class citizen into the fold. And for years, they've been very focused about keeping this under control in production and making sure that like they have their firewalls, they have their kind of detection system, their SIEM system, and they kind of looking at what goes wrong, and then they kind of give that feedback. Shift left is when security, instead of just looking at what is in production, is kind of does have vulnerabilities or is not perfect. It's about going back upstream into the development and that life cycle and kind of prevent security issues from happening. So on the pipeline, if you see the pipeline going from left to right, then, sorry, pun no intended, then it is about security people being earlier in the pipeline and having those discussions with developers so they can prevent the vulnerabilities that would happen before they start. I do see that many companies are now talking about shift left. If you're a startup and they kind of do all these practices of code scanning and kind of vulnerability checking. I sometimes say, well, if you're only doing left, you're not doing it right either. So you have to have a balance between what you catch on the left, which you can kind of prevent. But I sometimes say to some companies, they actually need to shift right, because if you don't know what's happening in production, you have no visibility, you're not following up your attacks and so on, you're blind. So you kind of have to have both, but predominantly in the past and in bigger companies where security had the biggest vote there, it was that they had this production mindset. But again, you need to have both to kind of have a good security posture.
So a good security posture is a moving target. I think we can all agree, right? Because it's constantly evaluative and different vectors and so on and so forth. But I guess the idea of this shift left is that you can perhaps involve more people, more competencies, and perhaps have a better shot at mitigating those potential problems before they're problems, right?
Yeah, and by that kind of reducing the cost of an incident, because it is assumed that when this happens in production, the cost of recovery, the cost of kind of any impact, it will be higher than it is when you do it early on. But to my point, you cannot prevent and know everything on the left. So if you're blind on the right, you're kind of only doing a partial job there. So.
Right, and back to your statement about optimize the whole, not just the parts. Right?
Indeed.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I mean, I'm an F1 nerd, and we could go off on what happens if you spend too much money on one thing, not money on another. But that's another whole discussion.
There's never
Shout out
enough
to
money to spend, though.
yeah, exactly. So when we talk about shifting left, and we talk about these sorts of things, really in many ways we're talking about communication, right? We're talking about the ability and the capacity for not only business units and organizations, but teams and even individual people to be able to effectively communicate with one another. So to wit, we have another great question here on the board. It's as if I know how to segue things. Can you give your top 3 to 5 tips, advice for managers, or I'm going to add even ICs, when they see communication issues, for example, between a platform team and engineering, or between an ops team and the developers, or between a DevOps team and another team? Like, we're talking about communication issues. How can we start to diagnose and remedy that?
Yeah, I think one of the mantras that came up very early days: if it's hard, do it more often, right? So if the communication is not working, try to do more communication and see if there's some way you can get to an understanding there. Another thing I learned is that when you're doing these conversations about like collaboration and there's tension points, try to make them less personal. And one of the easy ways is that you kind of say like, how can we improve the system? Instead of saying like, you're not doing a good job. It's kind of like, how can we improve the system? So it becomes like less personal that we look at these things. Same trick when you have two engineers and they're kind of arguing, try to make them point to a whiteboard, because the whiteboard is like the neutral time space. And then all of a sudden they're not like against each other, but they're arguing against the whiteboard. Anyway, it's a small trick that like helps a lot of the time. The third one, and I already briefly mentioned that, is kind of keep looking at what your real bottleneck is. So let's say two teams are having an issue and you feel that the security team feels that you have to spend more time on security, right? But you don't have that time, right? Because you're working on product features and there's other stuff that you need to do. It's a problem you cannot solve within those kind of boundaries. So you either get help and you say, hey, stakeholders, all of a sudden we're having to do two things and we're limited in capacity. What do you think is the most important? And there often what happens is when you kind of confront people that have to make those calls, is that they have a hard time choosing between both. So they might have been saying like, security is the most important, product is the most important, right? Developer speed is the most important. So they have a hard time choosing. But I think that's part of the challenge of being a product manager or product owner, is kind of finding that balance between what we need to do to keep things running in a good way. At Chopat, we call that running healthy, and kind of what do we need to have be doing on the product. And like any resource that is scarce, you kind of have to make a prioritization and kind of try to explain from multiple perspectives why we're not advancing on something else. And that's kind of the maybe the last tip there is, instead of optimizing one thing all the way through. So let's say I'm going to improve my pipeline to have a deploy in 3 seconds or something. That could be a noble goal, but if you kind of think about other things you can do with the time of tuning that pipeline. Maybe I can do some automation in the security. Maybe I can write a script that gets the data better to the business, or anything there. It's kind of like really also again start thinking about the real bottleneck and where you can make a difference, instead of trying to optimize your system or your area only. And I think that's the crux also of DevOps, like we mentioned before. Optimize the whole and try to see the other perspective that is also part of that system. And maybe they have more priority, maybe it brings more value, and kind of rest your case if that happens.
Yeah, that's absolutely sage advice. And I really like where you were going there with taking a look outside of the direct thing maybe that you're concentrating on, that you're focused on, that you're super familiar with, and go, wait a minute, if I'm putting 100% of my energy and my resources into this one thing, kind of what's the opportunity cost there, right? What is being neglected because we're not spending the time and energy on it, and factoring that into the decision making. I know, when I'm mentoring junior engineers, mid-career engineers, a question that comes up is, well, how do I get to senior? Or how do I get past senior? If I become a staff or senior staff, so on and so forth. And it's not magic. The answer is, if you want to, go junior to mid-level, just get better at your job. If you want to go from mid-level to senior, just get really good at your job. But if you want to go from senior to staff, you need to get good at someone else's job, right?
Yeah.
And that actually comes another segue, and that one was completely by accident, into the next question that just got upvoted, which is how to boost your DevOps engineering or platform career after many years, right? How to find the right motivation. What do I need to do as a DevOps engineer, as a platform engineer, not only to go to the next level, but also to find the motivation to go to the next level?
Yeah. I learned that this is very personal in a way. Some have a very interest to kind of stay in a certain domain, and they might become more of a specialist, and they kind of keep going deeper. Obviously, that is one way of doing that. But I think if you're going to be a specialist versus getting a broader perspective, which is kind of the route I took, but not everybody wants to go that route. Is that you still have to get better at understanding the business context that you're operating. So, like if you're progressing your career, it's not about you being able to explain how this technically works. It's explaining why you're doing this and the value it's bringing. So kind of like start seeking out the opportunities that you can do that. So for example, if you're presenting at an internal place or an event or something, already start mentioning why you're doing this, what is the benefit for the company, why you did not pick a certain option over something else. So kind of bring that business value in there. And you will see that opening up that kind of window or that kind of worms is really instrumental in your growth process to understand other things. You can obviously keep growing in other kind of domains. You say, I've worked my way through in the domain of kind of operations, and the next couple of years I'm going to focus myself on testing, and then I'm going to go do another job. And then you get a lot of perspectives, like Dan said, you get empathy, but because you've done the role and you kind of like understand why they're doing the problems they're facing, and you can become better at kind of understanding where the bottleneck is in the system and how you can move maybe the bottleneck and become the translator across the different groups. So that's kind of how I would advise people to progress in that, go from the how to the why, and then the why not just on the technical level, but the why on the business level, and kind of broaden that perspective.
Of course, part of the question there was finding the right motivation. As you said it, that's a very personal question, right? What motivates a person is going to be different from one person to the next. And what I think is interesting about that question is that even for yourself, it's hard to know what the answer is, right? That deep introspection that you have to go through to really find out what motivates you. I think people who are early in their careers might be motivated by something different from the middle of their careers towards the end of their careers. It turns out that money is important, but is actually not a particularly good motivator, despite what many of us might think. So, beyond what we need to do to advance forward in our careers, just logistically, part of that is just going to be looking inwards and figure out what are my motivations? What do I want? What am I seeking? And there's if you have mentors in your life, or you have people, trusted companions that you can discuss with, that's going to be, very, very important. All right, so switching gears a little bit, let us gaze into the crystal ball a little bit and make some forward-thinking, SEC-hating statements. What is the next big thing in operations? We can interpret the word operations here any way we want. So we've seen everything from, infrastructure as code, through Terraform, the rise of cloud as a paradigm shift, obviously. Now the return from cloud back to data centers, which is a thing that's totally happening right now, which is very, very interesting and exciting. And then, the one ring to rule them all, which happens to be Kubernetes right now. What's it going to be in a couple of years? Do you have any ideas about kind of what the next thing is going to be?
I can only, explain what kind of things that I've been interested in and kind of see evolve. last year I spent some time in the concept of digital twins, to be honest. And the reason why that is that I worked a while at Sneak, and you're connecting vulnerabilities, let's say from your code, your container, your Kubernetes, your API, your firewall, all that. You have to find out whether it's applicable, because it's a lot of noise that you're getting of these scanners. And understanding how the structure of all these components work together is one way to do the reasoning of, well, if it stopped maybe on the load balancer, I don't have to worry about the things downstream, right? So it's kind of creating this more of a model that you can reason on. And we've already seen this a little bit in, let's say, I think you have cube costs. There's a Terraform to kind of calculate the cost of the things. It is about creating like a structured thing component, whether that's a digital twin in a way that like you can reason on, you can test things on, you can validate things on, and then you kind of bring that into production. Anyway, so instead of going from the loose YAMLs, it's kind of like bringing them all together in something that you can reason on. So that was for me something that I would see evolve as the infrastructure that we're spinning up is maybe getting easier by the kind of APIs that are being created, but it's getting increasingly complex in the multitude of components that we need to bring up. So for me, that model of digital twins was one of the interesting things that could help there. What else? I think, well, I'm personally looking a lot into the AI space, and that can bring various things. But what I find intriguing is that we bringing things to production faster and faster. More code is being produced than ever, and I'm going to give you one example where I find it interesting. Is that imagine you're migrating from one language to another, and that legacy cost of doing that migration. It's something that happens if you deal with a new emerging field of technology, whether that's in mobile that was new, or serverless, or now AI, is that you have a multitude of tools and you have to kind of start switching faster and faster. I sometimes call this that after continuous delivery, you have continuous re-architecting. And then maybe I see a role of, imagine you have a better model, so you can structure all the information you have, and then you have more of an AI understanding how to do translations or migration to something else. Again, it is just a personal kind of inspiration that I think that we're defining more, and at the same time we're hoping to kind of do easier migrations, because yet another language, yet another tool in this space, we're just going to keep evolving, and that cost is always high for us migrating. So that those are kind of two ways of tools that actually help us do better migrations, is something that I hope something we can improve on. Instead of currently, it's more about we get more efficient about using the tools that we have. It's kind of like, yeah, try to make it more flexible, that we create less technical debt, we can create less legacy, we can keep things up to date as new technology emerges. Anyway, that's kind of my crystal ball from my perspective, but I don't know what the industry is thinking of.
Well, I mean, if we could make those accurate predictions, we'd all be extremely wealthy, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a handful of questions that are around this, and so you walked right into it. Is the next wave of DevOps transformation LLM ops or something like this? And I mean, clearly we don't know. There's actually a startup just up the street here. They're working on a really cool thing to do basically entire cloud architectures, entire cloud infrastructures, by analyzing your code and then spitting out what needs to be built in order to run it. It's still in early days, but I think there's a lot of really interesting stuff, in that space. So I don't think it's weird or controversial to say that maybe the next big thing in operations, the next big thing really in everything, is going to be very large scale machine learning, right? So-called AI and so on and so forth. Yeah, for sure, for sure. Listen, we could go off for basically an unlimited amount of time, honestly. And I would love to, in fact, do that. Unfortunately, we do not have an unlimited amount of time. So I'd like to thank you, Patrick, for coming on and having a little chat with me. Super, super appreciate it. And sharing your thoughts and ideas and opinions and experience with our audience. And thank you, the audience, for asking your questions. If we didn't get to your questions, it's okay. We're going to collect them up. If Patrick is willing to play ball, maybe we can see if we can get a blog post out of him or something. But Patrick, thank you so much for your time and for coming and sharing with us. And we hope to see you at a future DevOps Days Kyiv down the line.
Always a pleasure. Thank you very much. And good luck with the rest of the event.